Sir, you are sitting in an exit row seat. Are you willing to help in the case of an emergency?
Yes, I am.
As you know, sir, we do have a rule that all passengers must wear a face covering, a mask covering the nose and mouth. Even your governor has said so.
I'm wearing a mask.
Very funny, sir. This mask does not meet FAA or state requirements.
Yeah, but I'm wearing this mask just in case I do something wrong so you won't be able to identify me.
Well, sir, you have been caught. I do know exactly who is sitting in seat 14A.
Oh, okay.
Sir, now you've caused damage to the plane. I am calling security. Excuse me, security? Yes, we need you.
But I'm wearing a mask.
Yes, seat 14A, sir.
I can assure you that the oxygen is flowing even if the plastic bag does not inflate.
Security is on the way. You will be taken off the plane and arrested. There is a law against what you have done.
Arrested? Oh no! How about this? Does this fit? Does this matter? Does this fit?
Interesting, sir. A little too late. But we do have rules on the plane, and the rules are laws. And when you break the law, you have to pay the price. Security, please come this way.
Well,
Seat
wait.
14A,
I have the
please.
mask. Come with me.
Yes, right off.
Wait.
Thank you for flying Village Meadows Air. Right
Wait.
out this way.
Wait, if you'll just hang on, we'll do a Bible study on how to get along with the government. It might be from jail, but we'll do it a little later. Well, they let me off pretty easy. They didn't give me a fine or anything, but they gave me a big warning. So I figured that I ought to figure out how to get along with the government. And Paul was very helpful in his book of Romans in chapter 13 to tell us how to do that. And so that's what we're going to look at today, Romans chapter 13. So if you have your Bible, you might want to turn there. Have you noticed that you don't have to teach people how to disobey rules? I mean, 3-year-olds, you say, hey, share that toy, and they say, no, mine. Teens, the idea is if they're in rebellion against their parents or the authority, they think they have true freedom. And adults, well, we don't like rules either, especially if I disagree with them. We might just ignore the rules, or we might disobey the rules, or we might actually get caught. And then when we get caught, we say, that's a stupid rule. How about on Coronado, going south past Safeway? You know that spot? You go down there and there's a stoplight there, and down to the stoplight, the speed limit's 35 miles per hour. But then when you cross Wilcox and go for a couple of blocks, it turns to 25 miles per hour. And then when you come to Busby and you stop after that, it goes back to 35 miles an hour. Now, during that short span, you have a choice. Do you go 25 or 35? Now, most of us would say, I don't have a problem with authority, especially as long as I get to make the rules, or as long as I'm in authority. What do you do when you disagree with the authority? What do you do? See, many of you have seen this diagram before, but it's interesting. We see some sort of danger, some sort of thing that we don't agree. It could be just we don't agree with it, and then we get fearful and wonder, what should I do here? And we have two choices. We can either go this direction and trust God, or we can go the other direction and take control of our life. And oftentimes we make the wrong decision. We decide, I need to be in control. I need to make these decisions because, well, I'm not sure God is going to help me make the decision that I really want, or it might be too dangerous, or could be whatever. But see, what God wants us to do is put our trust in him and then surrender to him. That's what he said in Romans 12:1, to surrender. We need to surrender lots to him. And then he takes us to a safe place where we have peace, where we can live our lives and have a peaceful existence and not be worried about all kinds of things. You know, it's interesting, rebellion started at the very beginning. Here we are in Genesis chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. And it's the idea, he, the serpent, said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" And the woman said, "Yeah, no, we can eat from trees in the garden. I mean, we can do that." And it was interesting, the description of the serpent. The scripture says he was crafty. What that Greek word, no, it's a Hebrew word. The Hebrew word means he makes the most sense. It sounds so right. And isn't that the way it is when Satan tempts us? He makes things sound so right, like we should pursue that. And the truth is, Satan's focus is always on the what. On what is it that we don't agree with. And so what Satan was asking in that very first verse was, are you sure that God said that? Are you sure that's really what God meant? And his insinuation is, what if the what is wrong? What if what we're thinking about here, this action, is wrong? And then he convinces Eve by saying, you won't die, in verse 4. And then in verse 6, we see Eve's thinking. She saw the fruit, that it was good for food, pleasing to the eye, desirable for gaining wisdom, all three wonderful things. So she decided to disobey the what. And the what was eating the fruit off of this tree. She forgot about the who. And the who was God. He's the one who made the tree and gave the command. How about teens in our world today? They're old enough to go out with their friends, and so they get in the car all excited about the evening, and they tell their friends, my curfew's 11 o'clock. And their friends say, that's stupid. It should be 12, at least 12:30. So they're analyzing the what to make a decision. And Paul has something to say about all of this in Romans chapter 13. Here's what he said, verse 1. Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there's no authority except that which God has established. Now you may think, why is Paul even talking about this? Why is this even in the book of Romans? I mean, why is it here, for sure? And so we have to remember that the book of Romans, the whole first 11 chapters, is describing all the things that God has done. All the things he did to redeem us, to save us, to justify us, to bring us into his family. And Romans 12 begins with, here's how you live your life because of what God has done. And so remember, chapter 12, verse 1 says, we're supposed to surrender to God. We're supposed to surrender everything to God, including our rights, our desires, our dreams, every part of us. He wants us to surrender to him. And then he says in verse 2, we're supposed to separate ourselves from the world. Don't let the world push you into its mold. And then he goes on to talk about how we're supposed to love and serve our Christian family by using our spiritual gifts and treating our brothers and sisters with love. And then he talks about how we're supposed to treat our enemies with love and leave vengeance to God. And even though this seems like a random discussion about the government, it's actually an extension of how we leave vengeance to God. So this is an application of Paul's instruction to leave vengeance to God. One of the ways God executes vengeance is through government. Now, God has set up at least four that I know of, four kinds of authority in this world. He set up the family as the first authority, and he tells us to honor our father and our mother. We're supposed to obey them and honor them. And then he also set up business. You know, you get a job, and then your boss gets to tell you what to do, and so we're supposed to be under their authority. Then he set up the government, and the government was God's idea. He sets it up because we tend to be sinners. And sinners, well, sinners sin. And when there's lots of sin going on, there needs to be somebody to help stop that. And then the fourth kind of authority that he set up was the church. And we're supposed to be under the authority of God, and the church is his representative for that. So, but God has used government all through the Bible as his authority. He used the Assyrians and the Babylonians and even the Egyptians on Israel. And even though the government isn't always right, they do stand for God sometimes. They stand in for God. And God gives them the opportunity to do what's right. Now, it is true when governments turn against God and decide to go their own direction, God takes them out too, but he's put them there. And he can always get them to do what he wants them to, even if they're evil. So, in the second place, in the first century church, one of the best places Christians could have overcome evil with good would have been with government officials, because they had opportunities to encounter them all the time. Now, I don't know if you heard Pastor Mark's sermon on the first 7 verses of Romans 13 or not. If you haven't, you should listen to it, because he spends a pretty good amount of time describing what their society and culture was like, and why the government was necessary, and how they should be under the authority of the government. And it's the same for us. I suggest you watch that. If you haven't, you should watch that. And many of those Christians he talked about were low income. They lived in low income housing, just like in today's world. There's lots of people there too, but there's lots of people who are rich and have lots of money who live in big houses, but we all are supposed to be under the authority of the government. So a third thing that Paul said was that he may have expected Caesar to read his letter. It's possible that he put this in here so Caesar, who all the Caesars hated Christians quite a lot, he figured he might read it and it might go easier with him if he came in contact with them. He wanted to make his intentions clear. And many, even in today's world, want to remove the current government and replace it with one of their own, which is whatever they think it ought to be. Usually it's with them in charge. There were people like that in Jesus' day. The zealots in Jesus' day had the same idea. They wanted to drive the Romans out and take over the country their way. Islam is like that in many places. And different other religions have done that too. Some groups in our country are trying to do it even today. So, if Paul was talking about authorities, the government in his day, what kind of government was it? I mean, what kind of people were there? And so here's just a couple of those Roman emperors. Caligula was one of the Roman emperors. He was the emperor from 39 to 41. He didn't last very long because he was crazy. And here's how we know that. He had his mom and brother killed to make sure they didn't ever challenge his right to the throne. He openly committed incest with 3 of his sisters. He frequently would go out in public cross-dressed. He installed his favorite horse, Incitatus, as a senator and then promoted him later to a consul. Once he got mad at the weather and declared war on Neptune, the Roman god of the sea. So he ordered his soldiers to go whip the waves and bring home seashells like plunder from his domain. He had the heads of statues of deities removed and replaced them with a bust of his own. Often, during the gladiatorial games where they were fighting for their lives out in the arena, he would take random people from the crowds and throw them into the arena. Was he crazy or what? He was crazy, but he was one of the emperors when Paul was living. And then after him came Claudius. Claudius was emperor from 41 to 54 AD. He was slightly better than Caligula, but not very much. And then came Nero, who was definitely the emperor when Paul not only lived, but was writing this book. He was the emperor from 54 to 68 AD. Nero became the emperor because his mother killed Claudius in his sleep. That's how he became the emperor. And so Nero, of course, turns out to be one of the cruelest, most sadistic Christian killers of all time. He intentionally set fire to Rome and blamed Christians for the fire. He crucified hundreds of them. He had a party once where he lit up his courtyard with burning Christians as lanterns. So, these are all evil people that were in government, and Paul is saying we're supposed to be under their authority. That's what he's saying. And he wasn't the only one. When he wrote to Titus, in Titus 3:1, he said this: "Remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready to do whatever is good." Even Peter got in on it in 1 Peter chapter 2, where he said, "Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to command those who do right." Tim Keller once said, "The increasingly secular West is only just beginning to experience the level of hostility that first century believers faced. The 21st century persecuted church experiences every day, and it's getting worse. It is this type of state which Paul tells the Christian to submit to." Paul is not ignorant about the way we're living today. He lived in a world just like ours. And he gave some reasons why we need to be subject to the authority of the government. And his first reason is there is no authority except from God. He said in verse 1, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God." It includes Nero, Nebuchadnezzar, the Pharaoh. All of them had power over God's people. It includes the President of the United States. It includes the Prime Minister of Great Britain. It includes the governor of our state. Whoever resists, he says, is opposing God. Human authority is God's idea, not ours. Second reason, resisting human authority is opposing God. Consequently, he said in verse 2, "Whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted." So we tend to ask the question, what? What is it that I disagree with? What do I agree with? Instead, we should be asking the question, who? It's not about what, it's about who. And God is the who. He's the one who has established all authority. Third reason, they who have opposed God's authorities will invite condemnation. It's like sending an invitation. And those who do so will bring judgment on themselves, he said in verse 2. I don't think I want any of God's condemnation. And when we are out from under authority, well, God doesn't have to do it. Usually the government does it. Number 4, rulers are established to punish evil behavior. He said in verse 3, "For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong." So he's suggesting rulers rarely punish good, although there are times when they do evil things. We're all sinners, Paul said. Sinners sin. Sometimes we sin a whole bunch. And government was set up by God to control us and our sin. No government would mean anarchy. What's anarchy? Anarchy is sin run amok. All human government is not of God, but all human government is under God. He has allowed it to be there, and he's allowed the person or persons who are there to be in that position. Number 5, government serves to promote good. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended, Paul said. For the one in authority is God's servant or minister, sometimes it's translated that way, for your good. Do you ever think about the governor of the state or the president or the police as being ministers of God for our good? That's what Paul is saying here, that they are God's ministers to make our life better. Number 6, God empowers government to inflict punishment. Oh, yes. He said in verse 4, "But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer." Government will get you if you do evil. They have the authority. They administer the sword. God gave it to them. And so they will use it when they need to, and sometimes when they can. And then number 7, obeying authorities is good for your conscience, Paul said. Verse 5, "Therefore it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience." That's the way we should be. We should be willing to obey the laws. That's what Jesus did. And I'm just suggesting, if you're driving on a holiday weekend maybe, and there's all kinds of policemen around, and you wonder out loud, how come there's so many police around today? The passenger next to you might say, if you just obey the rules, you don't have to worry, you don't care. And that's the way Paul is suggesting that we live our lives. So, how do you like this? So, generally speaking, we, as Christians and Americans, believe this idea about authority in the big picture. For example, if there's a serial killer, we're pretty interested in the government either putting them in prison or executing them. I mean, any of you say, let's let them go. Now, probably the only person that would raise their hand might be someone who is a serial killer, but generally we don't want them around. How about a few years ago, we had red light cameras here. There was a big hubbub about that, and so much so that it came up on the ballot and the people in our city voted them out. So, did you vote for them to go out or not? I mean, do you feel like, gee, I should have the freedom to run through a red light if I want to? I mean, if I'm really in a hurry, I probably need to do that. See, we need to consider the who and not the what. If you don't like these 7 things, you're going to hate the rest. Because the next thing Paul says in verses 6 and 7 is, we should pay taxes. This is what he said. This is also why you pay taxes. For the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Jesus said the same thing, by the way. Remember, somebody asked him whether they should pay taxes or not, and he said, take out a coin and tell me whose picture's on it. And the guy took out a coin and said, well, it's Caesar. And he said, pay Caesar what is his, pay to God what is his. So we might say, yeah, but they didn't have the IRS. That's true. They did not have the IRS. They had tax collectors. And for non-Romans, the tax was probably in the 70 to 90% range, depending on how mean the tax collector was. Now, when you don't pay your taxes here, the IRS sends you a letter. If you lived in Rome in Paul's day, you didn't receive a letter, you received a visit. And they took your family and sold them into slavery. They became servants for somebody else to pay your tax bill. So, we should pay taxes, Paul said. This is an interesting prayer that Clement of Rome prayed. I mean, he printed this, but it was one of his prayers. He was like the Roman pastor, over all the house churches in Rome, about 88 to 99 AD. He was famous and has written lots of theological things for us to understand and understand God's Word. Here is his prayer. O Lord and Master, you have given them, referring to the authorities, the power of sovereignty through your excellent and unspeakable might, that we, knowing the glory and honor which you have given them, may submit ourselves to them in nothing resisting your will. Grant them, therefore, O Lord, health peace, concord, stability, that they may be without failure as they administer the government which you have committed to them. See, he understood that we're supposed to pray for our leaders, pray for them, and we're supposed to be under their authority. So, number one, what happens when authority acts sinfully, you might ask? Or number two, question, what happens when authority demands that I sin? Well, you submit to a higher authority. Whenever an authority acts sinfully to you and they ask you to sin, you should always appeal to a higher authority. Now, sometimes that happens in families. You know, it could be that the man is abusing his wife and children, so they appeal to the state, and the state comes and either takes him away or gives them a safe place. Or sometimes when you're being persecuted, which is probably likely to happen here, it's certainly happening to our brothers and sisters in China and India and Russia, other places like that. When they're being persecuted, we should go to a higher authority, and that's God. It's always submission to us. In Exodus 1, this is an interesting, you know this story. It's the Hebrews had been in Egypt for 400 years, and they had become slaves. The Pharaoh had made them slaves, and they were probably building pagan temples and growing food for the Egyptians. And I mean, it was terribly hard labor, and they were oppressed and beaten, and all kinds of bad things happened. But during this entire time, they multiplied. When Israel went down there was about 75 in his family. And when they left, 400 years later, after Moses came and took them away from Egypt, there was like 2.5 or 3 million of them. I mean, they multiplied over and over, which meant the Egyptians began to dread them because they were becoming more and more Jewish people than there were Egyptians. So the Pharaoh called in the midwives and said, kill all the boy babies, let the girls live. I mean, you know this story. But the midwives feared God. They didn't do that. And so the Pharaoh called them back and said, hey, what's going on here? How come you're not doing this? And so they said, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptians. They have their babies so quickly that they have them before we can even get there. See, the midwives submitted to God, not to Pharaoh. Now, it is true they told a lie. They told him a lie, and Christians are not supposed to lie. But I'm pretty sure we have no responsibility to tell the truth to evil. If you're at home, you have kids upstairs or in their bedrooms doing their homework perhaps, and a couple of people come to your front door with guns and say, we want to take your kids and kill them. You're probably not going to say, oh yeah, they're back in the back, and oh, by the way, I'm telling you the truth because I'm a Christian. That's probably not what we do. That's not what Rahab the harlot did either. She told a lie, but it was to save God's people. She appealed to a higher authority. Nebuchadnezzar, same thing happened to him. He made this decree, everybody has to worship me, bow down to this idol. And those 3 young Jewish boys respectfully said, we cannot do that. We're not going to do that. Our God can save us, but even if he does not, we're not bowing down to your idol. Well, okay, you're going into the furnace. And they said, okay. I'm thinking I don't know whether they had to throw them in or not, but they went in there and they were saved by God because they appealed to a higher authority. And then there's Peter and John in Acts, I think it's 4 or 5, chapters 4 and 5, where the religious leaders told them to quit preaching about Jesus Christ. And here's what they said in Acts 4, 19 and 20. But Peter and John replied, which is right in God's eyes, to listen to you or to him? You be the judges. As for us, we cannot help speaking what we have seen and heard. Do you think if I want to dissent, I can ever, talk to the government officials about why I'm discontent and why I'm unhappy? I mean, can you do that? Sure you can. How far do you think you can go? Well, I think you can go about as far as the authorities will let you. Make calls. write letters, vote, campaign, run for office, do all of these things. Because at the moment, we're free to do that. And we should dissent when the government's going the wrong direction. For example, suppose you are driving down Coronado beside Safeway, and you come to Wilcox, and you realize it's 25 miles per hour on the other side, and you get tired of that. And so you go home and write a letter to, I don't know, city council perhaps. Now, they have a choice. They could ignore the letter. They could just say, too bad. Or they might write you a letter back and say, yes, that is a great idea. We should raise the speed limit to 35 there. We see your point. We just missed it all along. Or they might also write you a letter and say, so, we don't like that you did that. So now the speed limit from Fry all the way down to Avenida Cochise is now 25 all the way. Could be either way. But however it is, you could drive 35 miles per hour the whole way. Although it's resisting God. It's not about what, but about who. There's always lots of what to think about. There's always lots of things, rules and laws and things that we don't like. But it's not about those. It's about who established them. So if something's unfair, do you think God sees it? Could God have a different agenda or a plan than ours, perhaps? Do you think it was unfair that the Hebrews were enslaved by the Egyptians? Yeah, probably. But they did flourish and they became a great nation. And God got great glory when they left. Or what about this? Do you think it was unfair what happened to Jesus? The perfect Son of God was arrested, had 2 illegal trials. He was beaten, he was spit on, he was hit. Romans tried him for a capital offense. He was actually found not guilty by Pilate, but still, they scourged him within an inch of his life. Then they made him carry the cross through the city. They crucified him. Was that fair, do you think? Did God have an agenda? Yes, he saved the whole world if they would trust in him. Sometimes he just has bigger fish to fry. He sees the end from the beginning. And for God's maximum glory, we need to submit ourselves to his authority. It's a choice that we need to make. It's a choice we make probably every day. And we need to think about the who rather than the what. This is a statement by Andy Stanley. I thought it was pretty good. This is why it is so imperative for those of us who are Christians to be the best citizens in the United States of America. Not because we don't ask hard questions, but because we ask hard questions absolutely under the authorities that God has established. You teenagers ought not to be people who never question your parents' authority. They're going to be wrong sometimes. But you ought to be the most obedient sons and daughters, not because you don't have a will, not because you're not smart, but because you understand it's not about what, it's about who. We need to be the most loyal employees, not because we agree with everything about our organization, but for this time and place when we've agreed to work for a company and be part of an industry, we play by the rules. Not because they're the best rules, but because we understand that our bosses are in some ways servants of God. You see, it's not about what, it's about who. You get to decide, probably every day, are you going to think about the what or the who? Being under authority is difficult sometimes, but being under authority is also part of surrender, and God has asked us to surrender to him. Hope you have a great week. Thanks for listening.